Good morning. Did you have a good night's sleep? Yeah? So. Mostly, okay. So, day 2 of the conference. We're already streaming live for the world to see us. And we'll be having 2 really interesting and amazing presentations today. First, we're going to kick things off with Brigitte Vasallo. I got that right.
Perfect.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. I never had Spanish lessons, so. And Brigitte Vasallo is a writer and an activist. This one time, I actually called Brigitte Vasallo an academic, and I think she almost punched me or something.
We got a big problem there.
Yes, I know. I'm sorry.
No, it's
okay,
fine.
I'm
I love
sorry.
you. You know I love you.
And next, we'll be having Nathan Rambukkana, who hails from the Laurier University and who will later today be also doing a book launch. So a very versatile person. So without further ado, I give you Brigitte Vasallo.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I want to thank you. Is right like this? Yeah, the sound? Perfect. Well, thank you, Daniel, and the rest of the organization. Some of you are here, Meg John and Maria, and so on. It's been quite an intense year having all these mails in English in my inbox every morning, waiting for my answer when I didn't even understand properly the question. So once we are here, I hope this is over, but I'm really gonna miss you. I'm not talking about the English issue just because, well, thank you to all of you also, of course, for being here at 9 in the morning, nevertheless. It's also amazing that you wake up to come here and listen to this conference at this time, so thank you so much. I'm not starting with the English issue just like that. We were talking with the Spanish and Catalan crew yesterday about the experience of making these things not in your native language. We really feel like our speech is like minus valid because we cannot explain it. The way is really in our heads. So this is really a difficulty. But it's also a great experience to feel what is the language privilege. As I'm a writer, I'm so used to have that tool. And I'm so good on convince people talking. And suddenly, I'm not that sure if I can convince you because I don't have my tool. But where I'm going, and I'm really thinking about the Spivak those days, if the subalterns we can speak or we cannot speak. What is really interesting on this is that it's giving us the experience of not having the tool, that we can translate it to other contexts. Here, for me, that I'm not even an academic, I'm not earning anything being here. It's a security space. It's easy for me. I don't care about the Congress. I don't care if I don't pass the message. It's okay. But when we are in migrant context and we are playing about having or not having a house, getting or not getting a job, or being listened for your children, teachers, or not being taken in count, that's really a super serious issue. So the ones that we are feeling this subalternity, let's treasure the sensation to put us in the other's place where we're gonna be back in our context. So I'm also starting here because I'm going to talk about power, because that's, at the end of the day, the thing that interests me in whatever I do. This is part of what I explain you of my place of enunciation. I'm gonna go there because I'm gonna also ask you to think about your own subjectivity in the first part of this speech. As I said, I'm a writer. I'm from Southern Europe. That, thank you, Miguel, to point that yesterday. I'm I don't know, probably, maybe, my speech is very related to that point, to the kind of relationships that we do in a specific place. It's southern Spain, is Catalonia, in concrete, is Barcelona, so it's a big city, it's not a small town, and everything goes through the way I see things and the way I do things. I will forget this all the time. Somebody can tell me time to time the picture, please. So, and I am an activist. I describe myself, I like to think about myself as an activist. That means several things. One is I don't deal with terms like wrong, correct, incorrect, right, etc. I don't care if what I am thinking it is correct. I'm interested if it is useful to do something with it, even if this thing that we're doing is to think about it, to refuse it. But I'm interested in terms like change and fossilization, challenge and resignation, revolution and reform. That's what I'm interested in that. I'm interested then in action. I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a psychologist, and I will not play to be, even if I drink from these places to also put in mind what I think. So the terms that I like to think, I like to put ideas together to see if we can make a change. That's what interests me as an activist. It also means that I put my body to think. I don't know how to think if this reality doesn't went through me, which is not always fun, I can tell you. I've been in this non-monogamous thing, and I do it like this because I will explain you what it means for me being non-monogamous or monogamous. But anyway, I've been through non-exclusive relationships for 19 years. That means that I went through a lot of pain and through a lot of happiness as well in order to be able to think about that. I think, I live, I think after or meanwhile, and then my thoughts also go back to my body. I really think, I really sense it. I really feel that I'm making a new body to myself in the way I walk and in the way I think. And also, or maybe especially, being an activist means for me that breaking with monogamy is a political issue, and a primary one. Because the way we build our intimacies is related to the way we build all the rest. And we don't build all the rest very well, as you can see. Because everything that goes in the macro is playing a role in this that we call the micro, the personal, the private, the intimate, etc. Hierarchy, I hate this word. Am I pronouncing it properly? I had to use Google, you know, the Google hierarchy for weeks. Hierarchy. So, hierarchy. Power, confrontation, individualism, exclusion, fear, that we've been talking yesterday already about fear and freedom, among others. Everything is playing a role here. I'm an activist on non-monogamous relationships and Islamophobia. That it's a big thing all of the sudden together, as we will see later on. So, those are some notes about who is talking here. And then I put, boom, back the ball down to you. I don't believe that we can produce objective knowledge because something like that doesn't exist. There is no neutrality on thinking. Even if we think about ourselves as scientifics, there is no neutrality on the way we think. We all have a frame, we all have cultural and personal tools to think, and all the rest is colonialism. The colonial way of thinking is the absurdity of believing that my own mind is a kind of bubble with no references, with no pain, no desires, no history. Have you seen that movie, Mars Attacks? Yes, you know these Martians with the huge bubble in their head? So that's the colonial thinking, this bubble on the head. So the way I see reality is not contaminated, is not filtered for who I am. And in consequence, that's the problem, because if that was something private that you are thinking that way, that's okay, but that has consequences. The consequences is that we can think over other realities because my thoughts are somehow essential. I assume that this that I said is clear for everybody here. But since we are in the academia, I will keep on saying it every time when I'm in the academia, because I'm sure somewhere in this building, somebody is producing colonial knowledge. And if we went to this person to say, are you producing colonial? He will say, or she will say, or they will say, no, of course not. So just in case, let's keep on saying it. Few more decades, just in case. So, when we produce knowledge about non-monogamies, it's very important to visualize our own frame and to name it. Because if our own practices are monogamous, we will read polyamory and so on from a monogamous frame, the monogamous frame. We will reduce it. We will reduce everything to the monogamous frame. This is what happened with neutral academia. Not the whole academia is neutral, a part of the academia that is neutral academia. When it comes to study us, I know a lot about us. I've been studied plenty times, as we were kind of monkeys in the rainforest, with all my respect for monkeys. And then they go back to their monogamous seats to create monogamous theories about our lives. You cannot understand polyamory, or however you want to call it, if you don't understand the monogamous frame. And if you think that monogamy is just a personal option without consequences on the way you look at the world. Monogamy is not what happened just in your bedroom. It's still there when you interview us. So, it's okay to be monogamous and work on this field. The only thing that we need to do, not to colonize this subject, is to name it and to make visible the monogamous frame from where you are thinking. We are coming, I'm not thinking that we are in the non-monogamy. Probably, I don't think at all that we are doing non-monogamies. I know that we are coming from there, and I will explain you now why. But I also know that we are not going to that place. We are trying to make something different. So that's why it's so important to think from which frame you are studying us. So, this is very clear, to name the place of enunciation and so on. Why is that difficult to do it for non-monogamous studies? I will answer myself. Because the monogamous frame is invisible. And this is because, as I think, of an old colonial way of studying the subject. Do we have anthropologists here? Oh, I thought no. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about anthropology, knowing that I'm not an anthropologist, but still. From anthropological studies, European ones, 19th century ones, we got the idea that monogamy is about quantity, about number of people involved. The European kinship theory decided that there was something called monogamy and something called, for example, polygamy, and the amount of people make it different. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples, starting for Levi-Strauss. Don't you think that I'm stuck with this old guy? I am not. But Levi-Strauss is still what we study in the Barcelona University when it comes to anthropology, and I have plenty of people saying this, so I guess this is happening all over, not only Barcelona. That's why I'm going back to that guy. So, a couple of examples. Levi-Strauss. When he talks about polygamy, and he divides it in polyandry and polygyny, he gives two examples. One example is a man married with several women. The other example is a woman given as a present to a bunch of brothers. It doesn't seem equivalent to me. To him, yes. Both are two ways of seeing the same thing, just a man with several women, a woman with several men. A woman offered as a present, yeah? Malinowski is also a good read. For example, for him, patrilineality means heritage from father to son. So we can think matrilineality is heritage from mother to daughter? No. The contrary of patrilineality for him is heritage to son from the brother of the mother. So it doesn't seem equivalent for me neither. There is other people working in this kind of subjects. For example, if you want a recommendation, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, she's studying the kinship relations in the Aymara society previous to the arrival and genocide perpetrated for the Spanish in the nowadays called America. Yeah? So, why I'm saying that? I'm saying that because this kind of thinking is really interfering on the way we think about ourselves nowadays. This accent put in the amount of people involved on that and not in the little detail that somebody can be free for do that and the other one is offered like a present is still stuck in the way we think about the subject. If we focus in the amount, if we focus in the amount in the particular and not in the structure that is going on there, we end up thinking, for example, that Christian monogamy and Muslim polygamy are different. As I told you, I'm a long-term activist against Islamophobia. I was living in the Arab world, not in any other kind of Muslim world, but in the Arab context. And I know quite well a part of it that it's like home for me. So, and I'm surrounded by Muslim, by the queer Muslim community, and so on. So, from there, from that experience as well, I can tell you that in the Arab world, in the part of the Arab world that I know, we don't talk about people in terms of monogamous and polygamous. That's just an hilarious picture to think that happens like that. We think about people who are married or single, nothing else. And actually, the word polygamy, that is a word invented from Greek roots, in Arabic, that is ta'udud fi zawaj, it means just multiple marriages. Doesn't mean something different than that. So 1, 3 is just the same. You are married, you are single. They don't ask you, are you polygamist or monogamist at all? So the colonial thought that defends that Christian monogamy and Muslim polygamy are completely different is the same one that is defending now in front of my horror that white polyamory is much egalitarian than Muslim polygamy just because. And after of this because, we have sentences like, women can also do it, which is a very partial argument, racist, by the way, because even in polyamory, especially in polyamory, it is not the same to be a woman than to be a man. It is not the same to be queer than to be straight, and gender, race, age, class, and so on are still having a role here. Just let me tell you that this terrible intersection between Islamophobia and polyamory is one of the worst things that happened in my whole activist life, is one of the things that are making me cry the most. That polyamory activists can be used to generate Islamophobia is something that makes me very ashamed of calling myself as polyamorist and to be an activist on this. We are creating, again, identities, minorizing other people that they are already minorized, creating another otherness, a monstrosity otherness, and putting us in front of them, asking for our rights and taking out other rights, and thinking about us as better, naturally, historically, culturally better, from our huge ignorance of what is going on with the rest of the people. I live here, the subject. So, polyamory, I'm so sorry for saying that, is not a secret recipe to erase the oppression axis. The contrary, if we don't see the privileges and oppressions linked to our love system, we just multiply them over and over. There is a huge amount of violence and gender violence in liberal polyamory, and we need to start talking about that because it's getting so big. I can say myself, as John Mack said yesterday, that I've been through plenty violence for saying this thing that for me is so easy, so simple to say there is gender violence in polyamory. I've been through plenty violence. I've been harassed, insulted publicly, and bullied in polyamorous groups in Catalonia and Spain. It's okay, I resist. So far I resist. I will not buy. If we don't revise our privileges, sex and gender privilege among others, polyamory is just a sexist fantasy becoming true and legitimate, and not only heterosexual. And I will keep on saying it. So, I remember now, a friend of mine told me, like, you know, before, when my boyfriend was cheating on me, I could go to the neighbor and cry. And now, with this polyamory thingy, I cannot even go to cry with her. So, my first statement starts here, then. We need to move the focus on my proposition is not because I think it's the right way of thinking it, but I think can be useful to do this exercise, to move the focus. Forget about the white anthropologist and focus on the power relation that we create within our love relationships. And like this, we have a completely different approach to the monogamy subject. And in my opinion, a much more exciting one. So moving the focus, I think we can find out that monogamy is a system. It's not an option, it's not a personal thing, it's a system. In concrete, a system of social organization that builds hierarchy in order to promote reproduction and paternal lineage. Yeah? So monogamy is linked to the sex and gender system and, of course, to mandatory heterosexuality. I know that we are here so modern, so queer, and so everything. So to talk about reproduction and paternal lineage is like, no, what are you talking about? Okay, what I'm trying to say and what I'm going to try to explain now is that it doesn't matter that we are not in the focus because the system is so complex that we are still in the corridors of the system, and the plenty things that happen to us and that we feel belongs especially to the corridors of that system. So queer polyamory or queer non-monogamies are challenging the final purpose of the monogamous system, but we are blocked with the whole structure that is forcing us to stay in place even when we try hard to move on. Maybe we are not in the reproduction goal, or we are not interested in having a father around our kids, but still we are kidnapped by the system tools. And which are these tools? We have plenty of them. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. Yeah. To promote reproduction, if reproduction is in the center of this system, to promote reproduction, the system needs us to be men and women. We cannot escape that. That's why it's so important to keep us being men and women. I assume everybody understands what I mean here, but when I explain this in workshops and so on for a more generic public, I try to make a kind of tale that is very useful. I explain where I ask people to wonder, to imagine what would happen if we divide humanity in tall people and short people. And then you can even try to put them in groups. You put a number in the middle. I don't know, an average number, 1.60 m, for example. I don't care. One side more than 160, one side, the other side less than 160. And you ask them to find the similarities on between them and in opposition to the other group. And suddenly you have a war there. People create like this an identity, a tall identity, and they have all these things that they distinguish them a lot from the other group. So a part of that, you put all the science, all the arts, all the popular culture, all the religion, all the philosophy, and on top of it, like the, how you call la cereza del, the cherries of the cake, you put Freud saying that some of us, we have penis envy, when everybody knows that we can buy plenty penis in any section, right? So we already have this big structure dividing us on these sexual characteristics. it doesn't work to divide us in tall and short, because tall and short doesn't assure reproduction. What it does is to make us being men and women, and making that idea become like so natural. So, for me, the way I think it, any radical challenging of monogamy needs to face a radical challenging of this sex and gender command. While we keep on seeing us as natural men and natural women, monogamy will keep on going on. It doesn't matter how many people we put in the equation. If as men, as natural men and as natural women, we don't revise the power structures inherent in these categories, the system will capture us and will capture our relationships. So breaking monogamy, for me, needs to deal with the dismantling of the sex and gender system and their privileges. Also, these systems mean sex and gender and monogamy not only creates this fiction of men and women, so creates the fiction of complementarity between them. I don't think that we are not complementary. I just doubt that we are complementary on between men and women for the fact of being men and women. Yeah. So there's a huge amount to make this possible, this complementarity, to put this complementarity in place. Mandatory heterosexuality with all these tools and all their ways. Homo, lesbo, transphobia, it's a part of it also. The persecution of whatever challenged the idea of complementarity, including slattery. And in this sense, I'm very interested on the asexuality and in the extremely discomfort that provokes between invisibility, sanctity, and persecution. I'm sure you're gonna give us so very good material in the ahead times to think about all these things as well. As we said, we can move one piece, but the system is still working. Systems are a very tricky thing. You move one piece, but then the whole thing click, click, click moves, and then it's captured and going inside. It's like we were talking about infidelity yesterday. I mean, monogamy has plenty room for infidelity, plenty of it. And still, I mean, Charles and Diana, they have a monogamous relationship, and Camilla Parker Bowles was there. No, it was okay. It's an infidelity capture by the system is not putting in risk the system at all. So I thought, I know, I'm still okay in this. So we can move a piece, the system is still working. As Monique Wittig showed us, heterosexuality, for example, is a way of thinking. It's not enough being queer to escape the mandatory heterosexuality and the idea of complementarity. So we keep on being half of something in quest of other half, even when we try so hard not to be monogamous. I think that we risk to create, if we didn't create it already, Miguel, a romantic polyamory, which I think can be a terribly painful experience. Yeah. So, to assure lineage, the system programs us to be exclusive. Exclusive is an amazing word. We need to keep out the enemies. We need to protect us from them. We need to exclude them. We need to see each other as potential enemies. And we need to make a strong identity with our partners based on addiction, by the way, instead of basing it on bonds, intimacy, and commitment. Actually, I think we build love the way we build national identities. And actually, the idea of romantic love in Europe is working at the same time that the idea of nation states and so on, and Freud and so on. They are all from the same 19th century that I would like to just maybe to erase from the calendar, and we move on. So when I say that breaking monogamy is a political issue, I mean this. To revise the way we relate to the rest of the people around us, refusing or trying to refuse to be afraid, refusing or trying to refuse to think everybody will hurt us, refusing or trying to refuse and to lie, has huge consequences far beyond our intimacy. I put this image. We've been through, or we are through, this that we call the refugee crisis in Europe. I'm gonna drink. I mean, the whole world is a huge refugee crisis. It's just because we have this huge amount of people walking and put it into trains going to Germany. What an amazing and terrifying picture, again, in Europe, that we react. But we have in Palestine, from 1948, hundreds of people as refugees with no place to come back, no place to go ahead, and we don't really care, do we? So, welcome to the big refugee party. We could fire gun them, but this is like not really so nice, especially when we have journalists there. So we need to do something somehow else. And when we try to do it somehow else, and I have to, of course, admit that there's plenty people so involved and plenty people opening houses and so on. I'm not joking about that. But when we try to fix something, there start these fascist voices up and down, you know, these people saying like, no, you will see, these refugees, they're gonna steal our jobs, they're gonna steal our wives, they're gonna take out our identities, they're gonna take away our privileges, and so on. So I can tell you that listening to them, I realized that that's exactly the way I feel when a lover approaches one of my lovers. So these fascists are the same fascist I am when I'm in love, the same one. So breaking the way I feel about my monogamy, it can put me far away also to other subjects that they are bigger than that. Breaking monogamy, finally, for me, as a political way of being, is not only breaking monogamy related to my personal love life, but is breaking ethnical monogamy, cultural monogamy, patriotic monogamy. And like this, we could keep on doing a huge list of the monogamies we are living through. So breaking monogamy, we must say which one we are breaking in every moment, because we have plenty of them. Anyway, I'm not saying that everybody should be in all the breaking monogamies. I also, when I started being like an activist like that, I was so happy. I was thinking I was meeting a bunch of people very committed to all of this, to make a very different world, to open love, open estates, open houses, open everything, open minds. No, I mean, no, it's okay. People can be wherever they want. Some people, they say, listen, I just want to deal with my 2 girlfriends. What are you talking about? What is this radical thing of feminism of you? It's okay. I'm just saying as well that whichever activist or non-activist we are in, the field of experimentation with non-monogamies in our private life, it gives us a very, very interesting experience to put also there. I don't know if you are aware, but I'm from Barcelona, I'm Catalan. Catalonia belongs to the Spanish state, and this Sunday we have a divorce processus. We have a very serious election to decide if we want to keep on being with Spain or not. Yes, right. Now I feel, a little bit, because I'm saying that, and people say, no, yes, that's important. So I've been asked several times in the last weeks or months in the mass media, in the Catalan mass media, about my opinion. And I'm sincerely saying that we are in front, ahead, and we are facing a monogamous divorce between 2 countries. But even the language that we used, it was the same. The Catalan president was saying, Catalan people, we need to face that. Spain doesn't love us. We are talking in terms of romantic love. And I'm really thinking that non-monogamies can show us a way to deal differently also with this kind of big macro-political processes. I really think that. When I say it, the journalists laugh at me. I'm kind of a funny character down there, but that's my political pair as well. So we were talking about the complementarity and the need that the system has to make this kind of addiction to glue us one to each other from an addiction, with an addiction glue. And I don't think that we will break the addiction until we don't break the whole width. And here, capitalism, individuality is playing a big role. And the subterranean idea that if one is not addicted to us, it won't stay with us. If we are so afraid of freedom, and we were talking yesterday about freedom and security, I think if we are so afraid of freedom, it's because in our world, freedom means individuality. So, are we still there? So that was the first idea I wanted to put in the table to see if it's useful for you to think and to act, to move the focus from the amount of people to the power structures that we generate and that we reproduce over and over within our relationships. So now I guess the question you will ask is like, excuse me, madam, where is the exit? How we break the system? And I have no idea of that. I think in January, I'm back in a Congress here, I think. So maybe in January, I will have the formula come back. We meet here again, like, I've got it. And then I have the mathematic formula. Well, I'm joking. I don't think that we crack systems. I don't think that there is a formula or a button that you push and poof, the system just breaks. I prefer this cracking idea that Holloway talked about, cracking systems with plenty tools and plenty ways of doing it. But especially, I don't think that you can just break or wipe out the system suddenly because we are the system. That's the bad news that I bring today. We are the system. It's like, you know, when I started with feminism, I was very young and I read my first feminist book, Simone de Beauvoir. Oh, I was in shock. I was so bad for a couple of years, seriously. And then one of the things that I decided was to shave my hair, to put out patriarchy out of me. And then I shave, and I say, I'm free. I'm free. You know what I mean, eh? You see, exact. That's the point. So it's the same. I mean, we are monogamous. The system is on us, so we cannot wipe it out because we don't have other body to live in if we wipe out patriarchy, if we wipe out monogamy, and so on. We need to crack it. And we need to crack it and build on the way new bodies to stand somewhere else. And I really think we are doing that, actually, with plenty experiences that we heard yesterday and plenty works and plenty studies and plenty views that you are doing and that we are doing. I really think we are cracking the system. So my second statement, that is not that long than this first one, don't you worry, I'm about to finish already. The second idea that I want to put on the table is that I think, as I see it, we are facing a crossroad here. The nuclear family, that we are like, oh, the nuclear family. The couple, as we understood it until now, it was also our last refuge to face the dismantling of communities. It was the last sure relationship in a very cruel world made of economics and rationality. Queer people and communities, we are already minorized and facing a specific violences, so dismantling our safety space is not easy and is not a joke. If we are dismantling couplehood and monogamy, or however you want to call it, to be liberal individuals going around pretending to be autonomous, just let me out of here. Just let's run away from here because this is a huge disaster. This is actually the biggest, latest dream of capitalism, is to break us apart. So I really think we need to choose if we are doing that or we are doing something else. I think non-monogamy can be also a way of subverting liberalism. I think breaking monogamy cannot be a way specific for that, for liberalism, but a way for building new communities and new ways of inclusive relationship that is actually cracking the system as the way I see it. Breaking monogamy, it is about how we relate to people with otherness and with our own position in the world, and how we question our structures and privileges. That's why I always say, I don't care if you are in a, not a couple, how you say a duo? A pair. I don't care if you are a pair. You have plenty of room to break monogamy while being in a pair. And I prefer 1,000 million times a pair that is questioning how they are, the power structures, the violences, the privileges there, than a bunch of people saying that they are polyamorous and reproducing all the violence neoliberal there. So we are all in the same, yeah? So that's a homework that I propose. I think probably one of our homeworks as polyamorists is to build a new committed concept of freedom. So, as a conclusion of that, I didn't talk about the pain. I don't know, the ones of you that you are non-monogamous, I'm in pain. Not all the time. These 19 years is not be like pain, pain, pain. I'm not that sick to stay there. I would move somewhere else. It's okay, but there is pain as well, no? So let's talk about the pain. I've just been through a very bad polyagony. I came here, I feel still, you know the sensation still in your body. And this sensation like, easy with me, I'm suffering still, and this thing in your stomach. So I'm like that. But then these days of polygamy, I had plenty of time to think about it also. And then I think on a metaphor that helps me a lot. That is about breaking monogamies, that like giving birth to ourselves. And that's why it hurts. We are giving birth to our new bodies. Those are the bodies that we need to inhabit the new worlds we are dreaming of. Often I hear and people tell me like, no, yeah, very nice your theory, but it doesn't help me with the pain. Well, it does help me. I don't agree. I think it helps. What it doesn't do is prevent you from having pain. But for me, theories, it helps me understand where the pain comes from. It helped me to feel sympathy for my partners, or however you want to call them, when they are in pain, and feel sympathy for myself when I'm suffering. It helps me also to stop feeling guilty, that I'm not good enough for doing this. And also helps me to accept that we have a long way to go, and also to accept that we must deal with our personal limits, that we are not that fantastic, strong, and fluid as we thought we were. And I'm talking to myself, believe me. So theories also help me to understand that it's not only about me, it's about not my lifetime, but about the way we can push with our own experience, the collective experience of living. What we are doing here is not only about love. It's about economy, it's about boundaries, it's about refugees, and it's about queerness in a way much bigger than our particular bodies and identities. For me, it's about creating an inclusive and radical way of being in the world. And thank you. Thank you. We continue and we make the questions and the debate later on. Yeah?
Okay, I'm gonna do this.
Yes.
You wanna keep it?
I want to keep yours.
I love this. This is wonderful.
Okay, what an incredibly amazing and difficult act to follow. My talk will be much less exciting than Brigitte's, but I'm so happy that you were able to hear her before hearing mine, because I think you did exactly what you said. You gave me the perfect kind of jumping off point. First, I'll give two provisos. One is that the topic that I'm going to talk on is not the topic that is actually written in the program, so my apologies for that. I was going to be doing a talk that was more focused on the history, the deep history of law and policy around plural relationships in Canada, and then with a view to the future and kind of trying to think about what non-monogamous futures might be. But that I couldn't get it there yet, and also I thought it was a little bit fustian and a little bit dry and a little bit too historical. So instead, I'm going to be talking about a more specific subset of that, which I think is a little bit more dynamic, and my topic will be on the kind of the treatment of polygamous women in Canadian public sphere discourse. So specifically, the title of my talk will be Unmappable Subjects: Intimacy, Privilege, and Polygamous Women in Canadian Public Sphere Discourse. So that's my first proviso. The second proviso is that this talk will contain some discussion of racism and Islamophobia. There'll be some discussion of violence against women. Just to kind of give that warning so that people are aware that that content will be there. Okay. 1. Preamble. In this talk, I will be addressing some of the material from my book, Fraught Intimacies, Non-Monogamy in the Public Sphere, which I won't talk about too much because I'll be talking about it later today, as well as some of my new work about the tensions between public sphere narratives about polygamous Muslim women and the narratives that these women have about their own identities and their hybrid positionalities as subjects caught between systems of intimacy, of understanding, of politics, and of national belonging. So just so overall, my work, and I come from communication studies, cultural studies, so this is where I'm coming from academically, thinking about not only how cultures develop, but also about communication in a broad theoretical way of how information spreads and how it makes us know about and understand the world, and also just the connections between people through things like media, through things like policy, through things like law, through all of these symbolic and abstract systems that connect us together as people. So as John Durham Peters, a communication theorist, reminds us, communication is not a process that naturally invites understanding, connection, or societal harmony, even though we kind of assume that it is often. As such, my work isn't an attempt to fix a broken system of public sphere communication around topics such as sexuality, intimacy, and race, and more specifically issues such as non-monogamy, polygamy, mixed race, diasporic, or hybrid identities, but rather to unfix staid communication systems, to refigure the public conversation about such issues and topics with a view to cracking open stable systems of meaning-making and working, as Peters reminds us we need to do, to build better communication across and between cultural and subcultural spaces. So in this way, my work as a whole attempts to work transdisciplinarily, developing frameworks, insights, and evidence that might have a broader relevance across academic disciplines, as well as outside of academia into realms such as journalistic, legal, activist, and popular spheres. 2. Unmappable subjects, polygamy in the public sphere. When Alfred Korzybski famously wrote, "A map is not the territory," he was writing about abstraction. And what he was trying to capture was that we need to become aware of our abstractions because we can't do without them, And since if we fail to become aware of our dynamics, we might start mistaking the map for the territory itself, the signifier for the signified. In my work, I write about the ways that non-monogamies are represented in the public sphere. Seen one way, through one spatial metaphor, representations of non-monogamy form a set of maps to the social and cultural spaces non-monogamies inhabit. We use this cartography to orient ourselves with respect to these territories, though their whereabouts in the atlas of intimate space are often like the part of old nautical maps bearing the legend, "Here be dragons." Polygamous women are the unmappable subjects of intimate representations, not because they don't feature in them. On the contrary, they are often a prominent, or the most prominent part of the landscape of intimate discourse, but rather because I want to suggest that in this case, the map is not the territory, and that the lives of polygamous women are caught between multiple mappings that have the effect of over-determining their lived existences, to figure them in ways that don't fully capture what their lives are about, or that even will go to determine what their lives are. The figurings kind of end up determining what their lives are instead of being the other way around. So the women of polygamy are hybrid subjects. Caught between multiple systems of belonging and intimacy, they embody the tensions between those systems. Much like women who wear hijab or burqa, women in polygamy, and Muslim women particularly, are, in the West, potentially caught between a patriarchal system on the one hand that even in more complicated readings of religion, culture, and agency has problematic aspects to it, and heteronormative nationalisms on the other that enforce a top-down intimate citizenship that is coercive at best and exclusionary at worst. This hybridity isn't the trendy hybridity, not the kind that lends glamour and cachet in the popular cultural sphere, what I like to think of as the Vin Dieselization of hybrid identities, but rather the more painful sort discussed by the less celebratory of those writing in the tradition kicked off by Homi Bhabha, while never ceasing to acknowledge that hybrid identities can be, after Bhabha, a third space, one of new energy and potential reimaginings of community, connection, and politics. These writers also emphasize that those same third spaces can just as often, as Faiza Hershey reminds us, be spaces of loneliness and of isolation. In Western countries, the public sphere understanding of polygamy as a practice and of the cultures, subcultures, or groups that practice it gravitates around one narrative, one discourse. There are inescapably problematic issues attached to polygamy, especially the dominance of patriarchal structures in most instances of its practice. But the overriding assumption that all of polygamy's narratives are reducible to one master narrative is a biopolitical sleight of hand that does a disservice to everyone associated with it, those who support and critique it alike. The complex and complicated, fraught and frustrating spaces of polygamous intimacy are foreshortened, encircled, and oversimplified by reductive discourse, often on all sides of the discussion, from within communities that practice polygamy, from law and policy makers, from journalists and documentary filmmakers, and from within the discourses of other forms of non-monogamy, such as polyamory. And when one considers Muslim polygamy, the challenges are multiplied. Issues of gender and agency become crossed and intersected with those of racialization, of migration, of class, and of citizenship status, as we see playing out in the tragedy of the Shafia family murders in Canada. So those of you who don't know the background of this story, this happened in 2009, where a polygamous man, his son and his second wife, ended up murdering his first wife and her 3 daughters through drowning. And this is a horribly tragic situation in which the first wife and her children came over to the country, but because of Canadian polygamy legislation, had to come over as a cousin and was kind of kept sequestered in the home to do domestic work, etc., and was working on trying to obtain citizenship status independently, but it had to happen in a slow and covert way. And so this form of enclaved identity, just as in kind of the fundamentalist LDS or Mormon communities in some parts of the US and Canada increase the isolation of these communities, which selects for, as we've seen in kind of like Janet Benian's work. Janet, are you here? She's here tomorrow. That can increase incidence of abuse. And I'll come back to this later. Okay, so approaching polygamy and trying to deconstruct our mainstream public sphere engagement with it is a daunting prospect. On the one hand, there's an ongoing need to engage with the structural iniquity of a non-monogamous system that is most often exclusively polygynous. But the way that this structural inequality is approached discursively is often a gross caricature that doesn't address the subtleties and complex dynamics of polygamy. The dominant narrative about polygamy is that it is patriarchal, exploitative, backwards, regressive, and often cult-like. The men prop up the system to have harems and sex slaves, and the women, who are mostly born into polygamy, suffer from false consciousness brought on by pandemic abuse from childhood and are in need of saving, as are the children of these unions. The narrative of Muslim polygamy doubles down on this script. It's backwards, barbaric, articulated to a distinctly Islamic form of male dominance in intimate life, is always arranged or coerced, and never freely chosen by willing female subjects. Or if it is, it's because, as Muslim women, they are isolated, uneducated, and don't know better. For example, you can see this in Canada's 2014 Bill S7 called Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act. As Suzanne Lennon talks about how this polarizing and race-baiting bill was crafted both to play towards a conservative anti-immigrant base in further criminalizing acts that are already illegal, such as conventional polygamy. And I should mention in my work, I make a distinction between polygamy and conventional polygamy, because polygamy just means more than one, like multiple marriages, whereas we have this kind of elision where we equate polygamy with polygyny, which is one man and multiple women, whereas polygamy could theoretically include polyandry or polygynandry, having partners with multiple different sexes and genders, and not even bringing in the notion of sexuality, which complicates things further, as I'll mention later. Painting all polygamous relationships as de facto exploitative, but it also acts as an alibi for violence against women, painting it as a mainly ethnic cultural problem, which, as Lennon points out, it is really a problem across cultures and for women in all walks of life, in all religions, in all types of relationship, including maybe par excellence, heterosexual monogamy. So the narrative about polygamy painted by discourse policy such as the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act is totalizing. It leaves no cracks, no margin of interpretation, no compromise. It's all or nothing. Any information that doesn't fit it is discounted, attributed to either rhetoric, false consciousness, or both. Another example of how this narrative is ill-fitting in Janet Benian's work on US FLDS polygamists, she notes that there are a large number of female converts to polygamy, rather than, they're all born into this. There's a lot of people who are choosing this and choosing this later in life for complex reasons, including seeking out of, quote, tight-knit religious and economic solidarity with other women who have the same standards and desires, and wanting, quote, to be connected to, though not dependent on, a man who honors his priesthoods and can enable them to bear many children. Another example is how, as Jemima Khan explores in her 2013 BBC4 documentary, Jemima Khan and the Part-Time Wife, Muslim polygamy is a growing modern lifestyle choice in Britain for older women who are divorcees, widows, or have kids, and who want the emotional, financial, and sexual benefits of having a husband, just not all the time. When this totalizing narrative is drawn upon to craft state apparatuses, women in polygamous unions are often marginalized by legal and policy structures that don't account for their actual marital status, such as in Britain, where only a first wife has a recourse to inheritance rights or the right to spousal support. This elision can place polygamous women in a double bind between male privilege on the one hand and legal and policy structures on the other. Studies by Status of Women Canada have shown that while some women can benefit from polygamous unions, others experience hardship or conflict. They conclude that, as an overarching whole, plural marriage cannot be characterized as either always harmful or always beneficial to women. Like monogamy, it just is. As such, law and policy used to curb plural marriage, either in nation states or when polygamous families try to migrate transnationally, is not universally beneficial to women in those unions, as it sometimes needlessly breaks up healthy and functioning families. But neither is it always good for women in more problematic unions. In privileging the heteronormative couple, those laws often privilege first or favorite wives, leaving some women and children stranded in one country while a heteronormative section of their family is reinscribed into normative intimacy elsewhere. And a couple of examples of this. So in some countries, women are encouraged to basically distance themselves from their children and give up their maternal rights, because if those children are just like the children of the father, they can emigrate to another country. Another example of this is the Shafia murders case again, where a favorite younger wife was presented as a unique wife for immigration purposes, while the first wife in the case was hidden and came to Canada officially in a different way, and working as a domestic worker, which is put her in a position that is precarious both economically and legally, and these interlocking factors then contributed to her risk of harm. So this system reifies both male privilege and a normative understanding of polygamous family dynamics through treating polygamous wives and their children as removable appendages to a male-centered nuclear family. Again, what Brigitte was talking about. The male is never the removable appendage in law and policy. Similarly, the complex intimate dynamics between and among sister wives and between women and the children of their co-wives are also discounted and elided by these structures. And I talk about this in my book. In an attempt to right what is seen as an affront to normative Western heterosexual monogamy, conventional polygamy is read through a heteropatriarchal lens that sees the man as always central to these families, similar to how in the discussion after Dawn's talk yesterday, there was an assumption from outside observers of polys that if there's a man involved in a poly relationship, he's always the king or the center, or like the whole, a woman shared among multiple brothers as a gift, that kind of frame, no matter what the actual dynamics are on the ground. So what is this? What this does discursively is reify the productive sexual relationship and the nominal marital union as the only truly important intimate relationship at play in these families, which doesn't even touch on potentially queered sexual or intimate relationships between sister or co-wives, a whole other topic. In BC, there are two women who are married to one of the founders of the FLDS sect there, who married each other and live as life partners separately, using Canadian same-sex marriage laws, but this is not really talked about in the news media. So 3, Letitia Angba, paternal polygamy, and Canadian immigration law. Sorry, I missed a paragraph. Sorry. In the following 3 sections, I'm going to untwist some of the thicker cords that bind polygamy to these narratives. So as I start to pull apart these various threads, pay particular attention to how gender and privilege play out in these intimate dramas, and how it is disproportionately women, and in particular women of color, who as deterritorialized and unmappable subjects bear the brunt of these overdetermined structures. Okay, that makes more sense. 3, Letitia Angba, paternal polygamy, and Canadian immigration law. So on November 22nd, 2006, Montreal's La Presse newspaper ran a story that speaks to some of the exclusions engendered by Canada's anti-polygamy statute, section 293 of the Criminal Code. In the story, we hear about a 16-year-old Quebec girl named Letitia Angba, who is appearing before the appeals section of the Immigration Commission. Wearing her Montreal private school uniform and beside one of her classmates, she's determined to explain to the commission that her life is there in Quebec and not in her country of origin, Côte d'Ivoire, but she's not able to get herself heard. The commissioner refused to hear the teen's appeal before the court had made a decision regarding the dossier of her father, Barthélemy. Letitia, the article informs us, is at risk of deportation to her country of origin because her father is polygamous. The origin of this affair goes back to 1992. Mr. Angba fell in love with a woman from Quebec in Côte d'Ivoire. The couple was married, moved to Canada, and brought over the young girl 3 years later. Letitia was then 6 years old. The Quebecois woman sponsored both of them so that they could get their permanent residence, but the couple got divorced in 1996. We hear that a year later, the Quebecois woman learned that Mr. Angba was already married in Côte d'Ivoire. She accused him of polygamy, illegal in Canada, and wanted to take back her sponsorship. In 2002, the Immigration Commission accused him of having provided false declarations to obtain his permanent residence. And 3 years later, the commission accused Letitia of being sponsored by someone who provided false declarations. So what's striking about the story is the way that Letitia Angba's status as an intelligible being, her physical presence in a country or in a courtroom, her subjective status as a citizen or even a legal person with a voice is rendered precarious by an intersecting nexus of factors connected to her father's alleged polygamy. Her case exists in the interstices between privileged logics of citizenship, race, class, gender, sexuality, and age. The event of her father's revealed polygamy collects these disarticulated factors into an articulated whole, a complex resolving into the singular fact of her imperiled citizenship. To address the issues raised with this case, I use the figure of intimate privilege, one that takes into account the complicated way that intersecting and interlocking privilege and oppression impact on people's intimate lives. For Angba, the specter of her father's non-monogamy is a catalyst that throws her own intimate privilege into question. And yet, it can only do so because of the interlocking nature of privilege and oppression. That her father was polygamous only impacts her intimate privilege because of additional intersecting factors such as the exclusionary nature of Canadian citizenship, coupled with the heteronormative logic of Canadian immigration policy. So the Canadian Immigration Act and Citizenship Act contain ethnonormative and heteronormative logics that profoundly structure what types of intimate subjectivity Canadians are allowed to have as citizens and as families, and what types of intimate subjects and families are allowed Canadian citizenship. So it polices inside and it polices the border to keep the outside out. So under the aegis of what's called family class immigration, quote, Canadian citizens and permanent residents living in Canada, 18 years of age or older, may sponsor close relatives or family members who want to become permanent residents of Canada. What the Act defines as family, however, is a rigidly policed conceptual space of blood relation or official spouseship. The challenge felt by polygamous families who want either to immigrate together or reunite their families in Canada is that only a single wife and her children are considered a part of a given family. This legislation can leave women and children who don't fit into this heteronormative framework on their own, unable to join the rest of their families in Canada, which is a constraint that can cause specific hardship for the women and children these policies purport to protect. The intimate spaces these logics define create oppressive constraints and exclusions for those that would inhabit them in ways that are largely unexamined and that do not map unproblematically onto responsible citizenship. So Letitia Angba's situation is born of the same dynamics that Ethna Lupheide identifies in her analysis of the US immigration control system and its role in the social construction of women's identities. In Entry Denied, Controlling Sexuality at the Border, Lupheide argues that, quote, a preferred admission to heteronormative wives and deliberate exclusion of those deemed not to fit that mold functioned as an ideological apparatus that was a key site for the production and reproduction of sexual categories, identities, and norms within relations of inequality, end quote. She continues that in seeking to ascribe these identities, the Immigration Service centrally contributed to constructing the very sexual categories and identities through which women's immigration policies were then regulated. In particular, she notes that the policing of immigrant women on the basis of sexuality also enabled the discursive production of exclusionary forms of nationalism. And her main case study is around kind of early Chinese immigration and how women were being discouraged from immigrating because they wanted men to come over as workers, but they didn't want women to come over because they didn't want them to have sex with white men to kind of pollute the purity of the white race, and because they didn't want them to become sex workers, again for the same reason. So this is what she's mainly focusing on. So Letitia Angba's construction as outside of monogamous sexuality or as an unwitting victim of polygamy are both produced by Canadian immigration discourse. Through the operations of normative power exercised within relations of privilege, these aspects of her family's intimate history are mobilized in the service of an exclusionary nationalism to re-narrate her as an illegal immigrant, functionally delegitimizing 10 years of citizenship. Even though Letitia Angba's case does not result in her eventual deportation in ways that are fascinating but too complex to go over in detail here, the fact that her citizenship was in question at all speaks to a broken system of bureaucratized intimacy more concerned with policing the intimate space of the nation than anything else. 4. Slippery slopes and Canadian polygamy law. So, during debates about same-sex marriage legislation in Canada, the US, and other countries, as Meg John was talking about in the UK, the figure of the slippery slope has been prominent in the public sphere discussion. An idiom that, by definition, means an idea or course of action which will lead to something unacceptable, wrong, or disastrous. The figure of the slippery slope is often used rhetorically to conceptually link up situations through an argument that allowing one will ineluctably bring about a dire other. So, in Polyamory, Social Conservatism, and the Same-Sex Marriage debate in the US, Edward Ashby traces the emergence of a rhetorical strategy devised by elements of the US Christian right and other social conservatives who, when faced with a declining moral outcry against homosexuality, sought to ground their anti-same-sex marriage lobby efforts in something which still had the ability to cause moral outrage, so polygamy. Ashby identifies in particular the writing of Stanley Kurtz, who in a series of prominent journalistic articles that appeared following the Lawrence ruling, which struck down anti-sodomy laws in the US, linked that ruling with an eventual legalization of same-sex marriage, then, as a consequence of both polygamy and, interestingly, polyamory, which he talks about specifically, putting traditional marriage at risk. So, in Kurtz's words, marriage will be transformed, I love to do this in the voice, marriage will be transformed into a variety of relationship contracts, linking 2, 3, or more individuals, however weakly or temporarily, in every conceivable combination of male and female. Once we say that gay couples have the right to their commitments recognized by the state, it becomes next to impossible to deny that same right to polygamists, polyamorists, or even cohabiting relatives and friends. And once everyone's relationship is recognized, marriage is gone, and only a system of flexible relationship contracts is left. To which I was like, okay, awesome. So, in Kurtz's cartography of the legal issue, social conservatives had found a more transportable energy. Fighting same-sex marriage was no longer about denying rights to a specific minority group, but about the protection of society from the inevitable consequences of de-enshrining marriage. If you open the gate, everything will flow in. So this persuasive line of argument was quickly transported to the Canadian context, very quickly, like the next day. In the run-up to the passing of same-sex marriage legislation in 2005 in Canada, hooray, Stephen Harper, then leader of the opposition, now our benevolent dictator, argued that, quote, the liberal support for same-sex marriage could evolve one day into support for polygamy, and that, quote, the traditional definition of marriage should be enshrined in law in Canada, or we could be faced with more radical demands, such as legalizing polygamy, end quote. So multiple levels of a slippery slope argument are evident in this rhetoric. First, there is the premise, though stated as fact, that a legalized same-sex marriage will ineluctably lead to a legalized polygamy. If you do one, then the other will happen. It just will. A common second premise in this slippery slope claim is that a decriminalized polygamy would make Canada more attractive for Muslim immigration. This premise appears often, such as in the following letter to the editor in response to an article about the January 2009 polygamy charges leveled against two leaders of the bountiful British Columbia community, which I talked about before, which has openly polygamous elements. So consider this. If the polygamists win in Bountiful, what will be the reaction of Canadian Muslims? Many Muslim countries allow polygamy, though Canada currently does not allow Muslim immigrants to bring in multiple wives. So it's just just to put it aside, Muslim immigrants are just men, and then the wives are not also potential immigrants. They're just, the property of the men. But if polygamy is recognized as a constitutional right in Canada, there's nothing to stop Muslim groups from demanding recognition for their polygamist marriages and suing to have their multiple wives and children allowed into the country. So some take this argument further, dropping the reference to protecting women and children, which I argue is only really there as a shield, and foregrounding the desire to keep certain things out of the intimate space of Canada, such as in this statement by Edmonton Sun writer Michael Coren. Let's be candid here. This has little to do with breakaway Mormon sects, but everything to do with Islam, which is growing at an exponential rate. Elements of Sharia law were almost introduced in Ontario 4 years ago, and Muslim groups are using human rights commissions, the courts, and media to influence and change society. In Europe, there are legions of polygamous marriages, and they exist here too. It's like Paris, the Paris riots. It is being chosen, and indifference is simply not sufficient. We need to close and lock the door right now. So, this cascade of slippery slope arguments in which legalized anal sex leads to legalized same-sex marriage, which leads to legalized plural marriage, which leads to an increase in Muslim immigration, which leads to a destruction of Canadian values, or even of Canada itself, throws the interpenetration of heteronormativity, biopolitics, and structural racism into sharp relief. So both of these first two case studies demonstrate a desire to maintain a cordon of privilege around the intimate space of the nation, one that is related historically to the origins of anti-polygamy laws in Canada and the US that Siobhan Somerville writes about how the US Immigration Act of 1891 codified the exclusion of polygamists, and Beverly Baines notes how Canadian anti-polygamy laws were originally written only a year later in 1892 to specifically deter immigration from polygamous Mormon families fleeing from the US. In fact, the specific language about keeping Mormons out was part of the original legislation. And part of the other talk was one of the reasons they didn't want to do this is because a lot of indigenous groups had plural marriages as well, and they didn't want the Mormons and the indigenous people to kind of talk to each other because it would give the indigenous people ideas. So, the immigration statutes excluding polygamous kinship connections, purportedly there to protect women and children, are not designed in such ways as to alleviate the harmful aspects of polygamy, but rather just to make sure that it doesn't happen here, marking such statutes as in line with a totalizing view of polygamy. If individuals need to abandon polygamy, and sometimes literally in the form of abandoning husbands, wives, parents, or children, to become Canadian, then what does this Canadianness signify, if not at least partially an exclusion? But if this is the case, how do we move beyond this? How, as media producers, policymakers, discourse scholars, and activists, can we address these representational imbalances, regimes of privilege, and distorted public sphere mappings? So in my last section, I want to argue that one way to do this might be to explore the tensions between normative public sphere polygamy narratives on the one hand, and the narratives of polygamous women themselves. 6, affect, connection, and contradiction in search of Muslim women's polygamy narratives. So what often gets lost in these arguments on both sides of the debate are the voices and narratives of women living within or who have lived within polygamous families. So in a new phase of my research, I'm exploring these connections with respect to the narratives of Canadian polygamous Muslim women, comparing to narratives about polygamous Muslim women, both inside and outside of Canada. But at this point, I still have mainly questions. Eventually, I might end up doing interviews with Muslim women from polygamous families, or just be looking at texts, I'm not sure. exploring existing narratives both of and on Muslim polygamy through textual and discourse analysis. So some of the research questions I want to explore in greater depth are: how do Muslim women in polygamous unions narrate their sense of belonging with respect to the nations in which they reside, especially in relation to Canada? Do the women of polygamy feel disenfranchised by Canadian anti-polygamy laws, including the recent upholding of Section 293, Canada's anti-polygamy statute, which maintains the criminalization of both men and specifically of women, because that was a choice, and they decided to criminalize, to keep women criminalized as well for taking part in polygamy. Again, if they were really wanting to just be helpful to women and children, why would they do that? Or even, and it accounts for formalized polyamory as well, which we could talk about in the questions later if you want. And if so, do they feel more disenfranchised by these laws or by polygamy itself, or vice versa? How do Muslim women who have left polygamous unions and the female children of these unions feel about anti-polygamy laws? And finally, when polygamous Muslim women discuss the situations, what do they say they need with respect to institutional or structural support? So from some very preliminary analyses working with secondary source narratives, I'm seeing a mirroring of that same complexity we encounter when trying to unpack issues such as Femin's Naked Jihad Day protests. So some women write about polygamy as a boon that has saved their lives, or else the true love and extended community that they've always been looking and striving for. In the anthology Love Inshallah, The Secret Love Lives of American Muslim Women, Sila Imani shares a story along these lines in her autobiographical narrative 3. She writes about surfing the single Muslim scene in the pre-internet days of Islamic matchmaking magazines, introduction services, and letter writing. Remember letters? She writes of meeting and courting with men and of marrying 2 times, once through an unplanned college-age pregnancy and once through a matching service, neither of which worked out in the long term. She writes about how a bond began to grow with one of her married friends, a deeply religious former suitor who became her spiritual guide and mentor in her reawakening spirituality. When talk turned to marriage, she was skeptical. She had 1 older child already. She wasn't sure if this man's first wife truly wanted this, but upon meeting her future co-wife, who after 5 years of marriage was eager to take on a sister wife so that she could return to full-time work, and experiencing their family, she fell in love with their way of life and became a full partner with them and their extended family, co-owning a business and developing her own practice as a doula midwife. The way that Asila narrates the choices that led her to a polygamous lifestyle highlights this important complexity. She makes her way to this intimate arrangement through her own choices and life circumstances. At an earlier stage, she rejected Ali, her eventual husband, because at that point in her life, his deeply religious lifestyle was not what she chose for herself. Later, she does come to choose it, but throughout emphasizes that, quote, the decision to share was solely hers. The narrative also speaks to some of the reasons that women might choose to share a man. The desire to have a husband and children, but also be independent, or work full-time. The desire to have an extended primary family, or to be connected to a spiritual community and practice. But there are also negatives. In Muslim Women Online, Faith and Identity in Virtual Space, Anna Paya discusses how Muslim women debate about issues surrounding polygamy in online Islamic news groups. She sees the conversation as falling broadly into 3 factions, with lively debates between them. Traditionalists are broadly supportive of polygamy as it's part of Islamic tradition, though insistent that it follow the prescriptions laid down with respect to it, such as how a man should not take on more than 1 wife if he doesn't have the means to support them or doesn't intend to treat them equally. Egalitarians generally oppose polygamy, taking a Muslim feminist perspective and arguing, based on Quranic verses, that absolute equality of treatment under polygamy is impossible, no matter how willing the participants, and that polygamy is so often abused by the men, contrary to popular belief, often due to neglecting or misinterpreting Islamic laws about it than by adhering to them, and that it is so often linked to women's abuse and misery that it's not salvageable. Finally, the holistic members can see some truth in both arguments. While they agree that abuses do occur, they also concede that this is not universally the case, and that it can be a good choice for some people, given their specific situations and desires. So this complexity of response speaks to how Muslim women's narratives about polygamy are not monolithic, and how there's much internal debate about polygamy and its place in the modern Islamic world, and whether or not there even is one. Paella also notes that the diversity of opinion in this group speaks to how there's clearly a difference between the experiences of those who may have been or known someone who is forced into polygamy and those who choose it willingly, adding another complex layer to the situation. And again, in the totalizing narrative, it's always forced, so it just kind of collapses. So, in conclusion, my new research is still in its infancy. In some of the narratives, Muslim polygamy seems to have strong affinities with polyamory or Western consensual secular non-monogamy. I don't need to have that in here for this talk. With passages about time management and controlling the impulse to jealousy almost seeming to be ripped out of the pages of The Ethical Slut or similar. Other times, it seems like it's close to these other discourse. Other times, it seems like it is close to other discourse cultures of adultery or polyamory in effect, but very different in origin, so coming ideally from a place of compassion and community rather than from lust. What is clear, however, is that in the Muslim world as well, more people seem to be experimenting with plural marriage. Sometimes, like for Asila, who has been happily married for 20 years, it works out. For others, like one of Jemima Khan's interviewees, Sarah, it doesn't work out and ends in divorce. Much like marriage, really. So by reading these multiple public sphere renderings of polygamy together, and we could add in other significant nodes that I haven't had time to talk about today, such as the televisual explorations of Big Love and Sister Wives, and the testimony and coverage of the polygamy reference case in BC, we can see how none of these narratives on its own fully capture the discursive reality of polygamy. Polygamy is heteroglossic, speaking with many tongues. Its discourse is polysemic, with having multiple meanings, irreducible to one correct narrative, one map. Like a queer take on intimacy that figures itself as irreducible to one specific identification, polygamy can be hard to approach for that very reason. The modernist impulse wants to reduce things until they have one mutual, universal meaning. This is, I think, the thrust behind the vehemence of resistance to same-sex marriage, and for that matter, to plural marriage. We need to address the structural privilege inherent to exclusively polygynous polygamy. But if we simply reduce polygamy to the abuses clustered around it, we lose the other strands of this discursive reality, the other narratives that get silenced or distorted to fit the master narrative, just as the dissenting voices of polygamy's margins are silenced to fit pro-polygamy stances. It is only through a complicated and multifaceted appraisal of polygamy that we can skirt such fruitless reterritorialization and allow polygamy to be assessed for what it is, an at times problematic, but nonetheless real form of conjugal intimacy. The one consensus seems to be that plural marriage doesn't seem to be going anywhere. It's a part of the reality of contemporary intimacy, and we can't ignore it any longer. Thank you. Whew.